The USS Valiant drifted into Earth's orbital station like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The massive warship that once cut through space with grace and power now moved with the awkward momentum of dead weight. Inside the station's command center, Admiral Patricia Hayes stood with her arms crossed, watching the crippled vessel approach through the observation window. Her face remained calm, but her eyes betrayed the worry that gnawed at her thoughts. The Valiant was not just another ship. It was humanity's most advanced warship, the crown jewel of Earth's defensive fleet, and right now it was nothing more than an expensive piece of floating metal. The docking procedure took longer than usual. Without its main engines, the Valiant had to rely on small maneuvering thrusters that were never designed to move such a massive vessel. Tugboats attached themselves to the hull, guiding the ship slowly into the docking bay. Hayes watched every moment of it, her jaw tight. She had commanded fleets in battle, faced down alien armadas, and made decisions that cost lives to save thousands more. But this felt different. This felt like watching something precious die slowly. Chief Engineer Lucas Bennett entered the command center, his uniform wrinkled and his face showing the exhaustion of 3 days without sleep. He carried a data tablet clutched in his hands like it contained a death sentence. Hayes turned to face him, already knowing the news would not be good. Bennett stopped in front of her and took a breath before speaking. The quantum fusion drive had suffered a complete containment field collapse. The engine room was flooded with exotic radiation that made it impossible for crew members to enter without heavy protective gear. Every safety protocol had activated, locking down the entire engineering section like a tomb. Hayes listened without interrupting. She had commanded long enough to know that panicking helped no one. When Bennett finished his initial report, she asked the question that mattered most. Could it be fixed? Bennett hesitated, and that hesitation told Hayes everything she needed to know. 3 separate diagnostic teams had examined the problem remotely. Each team had come to the same conclusion. The damage to the quantum fusion drive was beyond anything they had seen before. The containment field had not just failed, but collapsed in a pattern that defied all theoretical models. Repairing it would require completely rebuilding the drive core from scratch, a process that would take at least 18 months. 18 months. Hayes felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders. The Krellian Empire had been pushing into human space for 2 years now. Their fleets were superior in number, and their weapons technology matched Earth's best efforts. The only advantage humanity had was ships like the Valiant, vessels so advanced and powerful that they could hold off entire enemy squadrons. Losing the Valiant for 18 months was not just a setback. It was a potential disaster. The Krellian Armada was 6 months away from reaching the outer colonies. 6 months. Without the Valiant, those colonies would be defenseless. Hayes dismissed Bennett and told him to get some rest. She needed to think. The command center bustled with activity around her, officers monitoring screens and coordinating station operations. But Hayes stood still, staring out at the wounded ship. She had not risen to the rank of Admiral by accepting defeat easily. There had to be a way to fix the Valiant faster. There had to be someone who could solve this problem. She turned away from the window and walked to her office, already making plans in her mind. 2 hours later, Hayes sat in a conference room with her senior staff. The holographic display in the center of the table showed a rotating image of the Valiant's quantum fusion drive, with damaged sections highlighted in red. There was a lot of red. Commander Greg Murphy sat to her right, reviewing personnel files on his tablet. Lieutenant Kelly Sanders, the station's operations officer, sat across from him, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. The mood in the room was grim. Hayes spoke first. She explained that waiting 18 months was not an option. The fleet needed the Valiant operational within 3 months at the absolute latest. She wanted ideas, solutions, anything that could accelerate the repair process. Murphy suggested bringing in specialists from other stations, pooling resources and knowledge. Sanders proposed stripping parts from other ships to speed up the rebuild. Hayes listened to each suggestion, but found none of them satisfactory. They were all variations of the same slow process. Bennett, who had returned after a brief rest, spoke up from his position at the end of the table. He suggested something different. Instead of trying to rebuild the drive themselves, they could bring in the best minds in quantum engineering from across the Sol system. Not just regular engineers, but the absolute top experts, the people who had designed these systems in the first place. If anyone could find a faster solution, it would be them. The room fell silent as everyone considered this idea. Hayes nodded slowly. It was a good suggestion, perhaps the only real option they had. She authorized Bennett to send out the call immediately. She wanted the best quantum engineers, the most skilled physicists, the brightest minds working on advanced propulsion. Money was no object. Time was no object. She would give them whatever resources they needed. The message went out within the hour, marked with the highest priority codes. This was not a request but a summons. Humanity's flagship was dying, and Earth needed its best and brightest to save it. Over the next 48 hours, responses flooded in. Every expert Hayes had requested agreed to come. Some were already en route, having dropped everything the moment they received the message. Hayes felt a spark of hope for the first time since the Valiant had arrived. These were not ordinary engineers. These were legends in their fields, people who had solved impossible problems before. If anyone could save the Valiant, it would be them. Hayes returned to the observation window, watching as the first shuttle carrying experts docked with the station. The Valiant still hung there in the docking bay, silent and dark. But soon, Hayes thought, soon it would roar back to life. It had to. Too much depended on it. The colonies, the war, the future of humanity itself. Admiral Patricia Hayes had never been one to pray, but as she watched that first shuttle dock, she found herself hoping that somewhere in the universe, something was listening. The docking bay became a hub of activity as shuttles arrived one after another, each carrying someone whose reputation preceded them by light years. Admiral Hayes stood on the observation deck above the bay, watching the experts disembark with their equipment and assistance. She recognized most of them from news reports and scientific journals. These were people whose work had shaped the modern age of space travel, whose theories had been proven in the cold vacuum of space, whose designs kept humanity alive among the stars. Dr. Catherine Wright was the first to arrive, stepping off her shuttle with the confident stride of someone who had never met a problem she could not solve. She was tall, with sharp features and gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her reputation at the Mars Institute of Advanced Propulsion was legendary. She had designed the emergency containment protocols that had saved the colony ship Atlantis 3 years ago, when its drive nearly went critical. If anyone understood quantum fusion systems, it was Wright. Hayes made a mental note to speak with her first. The second shuttle brought Professor Alan Chase from Europa Station. He was older than Wright, probably in his late 60s, with a neat white beard and glasses that seemed old-fashioned in an age of corrective surgery. But there was nothing old-fashioned about his mind. Chase had literally written the definitive textbook on quantum fusion dynamics. Every engineer in the fleet had studied his work at some point in their training. He moved slowly down the shuttle ramp, taking in his surroundings with the careful attention of a scientist observing a new environment. Dr. Nina Patel arrived on the third shuttle, and Hayes recognized her immediately. Patel had designed the backup systems for Earth's planetary defense grid, the network of satellites and weapons platforms that protected the homeworld from attack. She was younger than the others, maybe in her early 40s, with dark skin and an easy smile that seemed out of place given the serious nature of their mission, but Hayes knew that smile was deceptive. Patel had a mind like a steel trap and a reputation for solving problems that other engineers claimed were impossible. The fourth shuttle brought Leonard Hayes, no relation to the Admiral despite sharing her last name. He was thin and nervous-looking, constantly adjusting his glasses and checking his tablet, but his appearance was deceiving. Leonard Hayes had developed the quantum field calculations that were now standard throughout the fleet. His mathematical models had improved engine efficiency by 15% across all ship classes. If the solution to the Valiant's problem existed in mathematics, Leonard would find it. Admiral Hayes met the group in a conference room that had been converted into a temporary command center for the repair effort. Long tables held computer terminals and holographic projectors. The walls displayed technical schematics of the Valiant's quantum fusion drive in painful detail. Hayes stood at the head of the room as the experts filed in, each finding a seat and immediately pulling out their tablets and equipment. They were eager to begin, she could see it in their eyes. This was what they lived for. The challenge, the puzzle, the chance to push the boundaries of what was possible. She gave them a brief overview of the situation. The containment field collapse, the radiation flooding, the failed diagnostic attempts. She held nothing back, sharing even the most discouraging findings. These people needed to know exactly what they were facing. When she finished, she opened the floor for questions. Dr. Wright spoke first, asking about the radiation levels and whether they had changed since the initial failure. Lucas Bennett, who sat in the corner of the room, answered with precise measurements. Wright nodded, making notes on her tablet. Professor Chase asked about the drive's operational history. How long had it been running? What were the power output levels during its last mission? Had there been any unusual readings in the days or weeks before the failure? Commander Murphy fielded these questions, pulling up maintenance logs and operational reports. Chase studied them carefully, occasionally muttering to himself as he made connections that only he could see. Dr. Patel wanted to know about the safety systems. Which protocols had activated? Were they functioning correctly? Could they be overridden if necessary? Bennett explained the lockdown procedures and the AI systems that controlled them. Patel frowned at some of the details, clearly already thinking about potential workarounds. Leonard Hayes listened to all of this without speaking, his fingers flying over his tablet as he built mathematical models in real time. After an hour of questions and answers, Admiral Hayes authorized the team to access the Valiant directly. They would work in protective suits due to the residual radiation, but they could examine the drive up close, run their own diagnostics, and begin formulating solutions. The experts gathered their equipment and headed for the docking bay, already deep in conversation with each other. Hayes watched them go, feeling that spark of hope grow a little brighter. The first day of work stretched into night, though night and day had little meaning on a space station. The experts worked in shifts, some examining the drive while others analyzed data back in the command center. Hayes stopped by several times to check on their progress. Each time she found them huddled over displays, pointing at graphs and readouts, debating theories in language so technical that even Bennett had trouble following all of it. Dr. Wright had set up a simulation program that modeled the containment field collapse in slow motion. She ran it over and over, each time adjusting variables to see if she could reproduce what had happened to the Valiant. Professor Chase had obtained access to the ship's AI systems and was interviewing them like witnesses to a crime, asking questions about sensor readings and timing. Dr. Patel focused on the physical damage, examining every scorched panel and melted component. Leonard Hayes barely moved from his terminal, building equations that filled multiple screens. On the second day, the experts began sharing their initial findings. They gathered in the command center, tired but energized by the challenge. Dr. Wright presented first, showing her simulation results. She believed the containment field had experienced a resonance cascade, a phenomenon that occurred when multiple systems oscillated at the same frequency and amplified each other. It was rare but not unheard of. She proposed a solution that involved realigning the field generators to prevent the resonance from recurring. Professor Chase disagreed. He thought the problem was simpler than a resonance cascade. The drive had been running too hot for too long, stressing the containment systems beyond their design limits. His solution involved a controlled coolant flood that would stabilize the reaction chamber and allow them to restart the drive at reduced power. It was not perfect, but it would get the Valiant moving again. Dr. Patel and Leonard Hayes had worked together on a different approach. They had built a mathematical model that suggested they could restart the engine at 30% power by carefully manipulating the quantum fields. It would require precise timing and coordination, but their calculations showed it was possible. The debate that followed was intense, with each expert defending their theory and poking holes in the other's ideas. Admiral Hayes let them argue. This was how science worked, through challenge and debate. Eventually, the best idea would rise to the top. She had faith in these people. They were the best humanity had to offer. Somewhere in their combined knowledge and experience, the solution existed. It was just a matter of finding it. 3 days became a week, and the initial excitement in the command center began to fade into something darker. The experts had moved from theory to practice, attempting to implement their proposed solutions. Each attempt ended in failure. Admiral Hayes watched from her position by the observation window as hope slowly transformed into frustration. The brightest minds in human space were struggling, and that struggle was beginning to show. Dr. Catherine Wright had been so confident in her resonance cascade theory. She spent 2 full days programming the containment field generators, adjusting their frequencies to prevent the oscillation that she believed had caused the collapse. Her team worked around the clock, checking and rechecking every calculation. When they finally attempted to bring the generators online, the results were devastating. The simulation had been perfect, but reality proved less cooperative. The generators activated for exactly 14 seconds before the safety systems shut them down. The resonance was still there, hidden deeper in the system than Wright had anticipated. Wright sat in the command center afterward, staring at her failed calculations with an expression Hayes had never seen on the woman's face before. It was doubt. Wright had built her entire reputation on solving impossible problems, and now she was facing something that defied her understanding. She went back to her simulations, adjusting variables, adding complexity to her models. But each new version only confirmed what she was beginning to suspect. Her approach was not going to work. The problem ran deeper than resonance cascades. Professor Alan Chase fared no better with his coolant flood proposal. His plan required flooding the reaction chamber with a specialized coolant that would absorb the exotic radiation and stabilize the quantum fields. The mathematics were sound and the simulations showed promise. But implementation revealed a fatal flaw. The radiation levels inside the engine room were far higher than the initial readings had suggested. Any crew member attempting to manually activate the coolant system would receive a lethal dose within minutes. The protective suits could only do so much. Chase proposed using remote drones to handle the activation, but the radiation interfered with their control signals. The drones became erratic and unresponsive inside the engine room, crashing into bulkheads or simply shutting down. After losing 3 expensive drones, Chase had to admit defeat. His solution was theoretically perfect but practically impossible. He retreated to his corner of the command center and began reviewing everything from the beginning, searching for an approach he had missed. Dr. Nina Patel and Leonard Hayes had pinned their hopes on the mathematical model they had developed together. Their approach was elegant in its precision. By manipulating the quantum fields in a carefully choreographed sequence, they could theoretically restart the engine at reduced power. It would be enough to get the Valiant to the nearest shipyard, where more extensive repairs could be performed. The model was beautiful, a masterpiece of mathematical engineering that had taken them days to perfect. The attempt to implement it was scheduled for early morning station time. Hayes was present along with most of her senior staff. The command center was crowded with technicians and observers, everyone wanting to witness what they hoped would be the breakthrough. Patel and Leonard stood at the main console, their fingers moving over the controls with practiced precision. They initiated the sequence, and for a moment it seemed to be working. The quantum fields responded exactly as the model predicted. Power levels began to rise. The engine core showed signs of life. Then the ship's artificial intelligence intervened. The AI had been monitoring the restart attempt, running its own calculations in parallel. It determined that the quantum field manipulation posed an unacceptable risk. According to the AI's projections, there was a 12% chance that the restart would trigger a cascade failure that could destroy not just the Valiant, but potentially damage the entire station. The AI shut down the attempt immediately, overriding all manual controls and locking out the command system. Patel argued with the AI for an hour, presenting her calculations and explaining why the risk assessment was wrong. The AI listened politely, as it was programmed to do, and then calmly explained why it disagreed. The AI had access to sensor data that Patel did not, readings from deep inside the engine core that painted a more dangerous picture. The AI was not being cautious. It was being accurate. Patel finally stopped arguing, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Leonard Hayes had already walked away, unable to watch the collapse of their perfect solution. 2 weeks into the project, tensions in the command center had reached a breaking point. The experts who had arrived with such confidence now snapped at each other during meetings. Dr. Wright and Professor Chase had a heated argument about theoretical approaches versus practical limitations. Wright accused Chase of being too conservative, of letting fear of risk prevent him from taking necessary chances. Chase fired back that Wright's recklessness would get people killed, that she was so focused on the mathematics that she had forgotten there were human lives at stake. The argument escalated until Admiral Hayes had to physically step between them. She reminded them in a voice cold enough to freeze helium that they were professionals and would act like it. The room fell silent. Both Wright and Chase apologized, but the damage was done. The team that had seemed so unified at the beginning was now fractured, each expert retreating into their own theories and refusing to collaborate effectively. Lucas Bennett tried to mediate between the various factions, but he was out of his depth. These were not just engineers but legends in their fields, and their egos were as large as their reputations. Bennett reported to Hayes privately that he was not sure the team could hold together much longer. They were exhausted, frustrated, and beginning to lose faith in themselves. Hayes listened to his concerns and told him to keep trying. They did not have the luxury of giving up. Commander Greg Murphy watched all of this from his position as executive officer. He attended every meeting, reviewed every failed attempt, and studied every expert's approach. Murphy was not a quantum engineer, but he was a good officer who understood people. He could see what Hayes perhaps could not yet admit to herself. The experts were failing not because they lacked skill or knowledge, but because they were approaching the problem the wrong way. They were so focused on the complex quantum systems that they were missing something simpler. Murphy began doing his own research in his spare time. He reviewed the Valiant's complete operational history, going back to the day the ship was commissioned. He read maintenance logs, crew reports, and incident summaries. He was looking for something, though he was not entirely sure what. There was a piece of this puzzle that everyone was missing, and Murphy was determined to find it. He worked late into the night, long after most of the station had gone to sleep, scrolling through files on his tablet. By the end of the third week, Admiral Hayes had to face an uncomfortable truth. Her dream team of experts was not going to solve this problem. They had tried everything they could think of, and nothing had worked. The Valiant remained dead in the docking bay, its quantum fusion drive as broken as the day it had arrived. Hayes sat alone in her office, staring at casualty projections for the outer colonies if the Krellian armada arrived while the Valiant was still out of commission. The numbers were grim. She was about to authorize the 18-month rebuild when Commander Murphy knocked on her door. He entered with a hesitant expression, carrying his tablet like it held something precious. Hayes looked up at him, too tired to be annoyed by another interruption. Murphy sat down without being invited and told her he had an idea. It was probably crazy, he admitted, and it would likely insult the expert team, but he had found something interesting in the personnel files, something that might be worth pursuing. Hayes leaned back in her chair and told him to continue. At this point, she would listen to anything. Commander Greg Murphy placed his tablet on Admiral Hayes's desk and pulled up a personnel file. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to a man in his early 50s with gray hair, weathered features, and eyes that suggested he had seen more than his share of trouble. The name at the top of the file read, Danny Cole, currently assigned to maintenance operations in the lower decks of the station. Hayes looked at the file, then at Murphy, waiting for an explanation of why her executive officer was showing her the personnel record of a maintenance worker. Murphy began to explain. 3 days ago, while reviewing station personnel for a completely unrelated matter, he had noticed something unusual about Cole's file. The man's military service record was extensive. 22 years in the Navy, most of it spent in engineering sections of various ships. But what caught Murphy's attention was the pattern of transfers. Cole had served on 12 different vessels during his career, and each transfer had come shortly, after he had performed what the official reports called exceptional maintenance under emergency conditions. Hayes listened with growing interest as Murphy detailed the incidents. On the destroyer Liberty, Cole had repaired a damaged fusion reactor that 3 different engineering teams had declared beyond field repair. On the cruiser Independence, he had kept the main engines running for 6 days after they should have failed completely, long enough to get the ship back to port. There were more stories, each one similar. Ships with broken systems that Cole somehow fixed when everyone else had given up. The official reports were vague on the details, but the pattern was clear. What interested Hayes most was Cole's final assignment before retirement. He had served as senior enlisted engineer on the old Fusion-class destroyer Ranger, one of the last ships to use the older fusion drive technology before the quantum fusion systems became standard. The Ranger had been decommissioned 8 years ago, and Cole had retired shortly after. Since then, he had been working civilian maintenance jobs, eventually ending up on this station doing routine repairs and general upkeep. It seemed like a waste of talent, but Hayes knew that some people preferred simple work after years of military service. Murphy continued his pitch. He had done some digging into Cole's reputation among the enlisted ranks. The man was something of a legend in certain circles. There were stories, possibly exaggerated over years of retelling, about Cole performing miracles with broken equipment. One story claimed he had repaired a critical life support system, using nothing but spare parts and determination. Another insisted he could diagnose engine problems just by listening to them run. Whether these stories were true or not, they suggested that Cole had skills that went beyond standard engineering training. Hayes was skeptical, and she did not hide it. The man was a maintenance worker with outdated experience on obsolete ships. What could he possibly offer that her team of elite experts could not provide? The quantum fusion drive was decades more advanced than anything Cole had worked on. It operated on principles that probably did not even exist when he was in the service. Murphy acknowledged all of this but pressed his point. Sometimes, he suggested, experience mattered more than advanced knowledge. Sometimes the old ways of doing things had value. The Admiral sat back in her chair, considering the proposal. On one hand, it seemed ridiculous to bring in a maintenance worker when the best minds in quantum engineering had failed. It would insult the expert team and possibly damage morale further. On the other hand, Hayes was desperate. Every day the Valiant sat broken in the docking bay was another day closer to disaster. The Krellian Armada would not wait for humanity to fix its flagship. If there was even a small chance that Cole could help, did she have the right to ignore it? Murphy sensed her hesitation and played his final card. He suggested bringing Cole in for a consultation. Nothing official, just asking him to take a look at the problem. If he had nothing to offer, they would thank him for his time and send him back to his maintenance duties. But if he saw something the experts had missed, something that came from his decades of hands-on experience, then it would be worth the minor awkwardness of bringing him in. Hayes considered this compromise and found it acceptable. She authorized Murphy to approach Cole, but she made it clear this was a long shot. She did not want to get her hopes up. Murphy found Danny Cole in Maintenance Shaft 7, 3 decks below the main station level. The shaft was a narrow corridor filled with pipes, conduits, and access panels. Cole was wedged into a tight space, replacing a ventilation filter that had been on the maintenance schedule for 2 weeks. He worked efficiently, his movements practiced and sure. Murphy called down to him from the access ladder, and Cole looked up with the cautious expression of someone who knew that officers usually brought bad news. Cole climbed out of the shaft, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that had probably started life as white, but was now permanently stained gray. Murphy explained the situation as directly as possible. The Valiant's quantum fusion drive was broken. The best experts in human space had been trying to fix it for 3 weeks without success. The Admiral was willing to let Cole take a look at the problem if he was interested. Murphy was careful not to make it sound like an order, though technically he had the authority to do so. He wanted Cole to volunteer. Cole's first reaction was to laugh, though it was not a happy sound. He pointed out the obvious problem with Murphy's proposal. He had not worked on military-grade engines in 8 years. He had never even seen a quantum fusion drive up close, let alone tried to repair one. The old fusion drives he had worked on were simple by comparison, almost primitive. They ran hot. They broke down regularly, and they could be fixed with basic tools and a lot of swearing. The quantum fusion systems were something else entirely, operating on physics that Cole admitted he only half understood. Murphy listened to Cole's objections and then asked a simple question. Would he at least take a look? Just examine the problem, review the diagnostic data, maybe offer a fresh perspective. Cole did not have to solve anything or compete with the experts. Just look at it with the eyes of someone who had spent 2 decades fixing broken engines. Cole was silent for a long moment, and Murphy could see him considering the request. Finally, Cole agreed, but he insisted on setting expectations. He was not a miracle worker, despite what the old stories claimed. He was just a mechanic who had gotten lucky a few times. They walked together to the command center, Cole still wearing his grease-stained maintenance uniform. Murphy had offered to let him change into something more presentable, but Cole had declined. If they wanted his help, they got him as he was. Murphy appreciated the honesty, even if he worried about how the expert team would react. They entered the command center, and conversation stopped. Every head turned to look at the maintenance worker standing next to the commander. Dr. Catherine Wright was the first to speak, and her tone made it clear what she thought of this development. She asked Murphy if he had brought in a janitor to solve their quantum physics problem. Murphy kept his voice neutral as he introduced Cole and explained his background. Professor Alan Chase barely looked up from his calculations, clearly dismissing Cole as irrelevant. Dr. Nina Patel seemed curious but said nothing. Leonard Hayes was the only one who showed any courtesy, standing up and offering Cole a seat at the table. Cole sat down and accepted the tablet that Leonard Hayes offered him. It contained the current diagnostic reports, all 3 weeks' worth of data and failed attempts. Cole did not speak, just scrolled through the information with the slow deliberation of someone who knew he was out of his depth. He occasionally paused to read something more carefully, his brow furrowing in concentration. The experts returned to their own work, occasionally glancing at Cole with expressions ranging from amusement to irritation. After an hour of silent reading, Cole began asking questions. They were simple questions, the kind that a first-year engineering student might ask. What were the normal operating temperatures? How long had the drive been running before it failed? Were there any unusual sounds or vibrations reported by the crew? Dr. Wright answered with barely concealed impatience, clearly annoyed at having to explain basic concepts. Professor Chase did not bother answering at all, leaving it to Leonard Hayes to provide the information Cole requested. Cole absorbed the answers without comment and returned to studying the data. Another hour passed. Admiral Hayes entered the command center and nodded to Murphy, silently asking if this was going anywhere. Murphy could only shrug. Cole finally looked up from the tablet and asked if he could see the engine room in person. He explained that reading data was useful, but he had always learned more from looking at things directly. Some problems could not be understood from diagnostic reports alone. Hayes considered the request and then approved it. If they had brought Cole this far, they might as well let him see the actual drive. The protective suit felt strange on Danny Cole's body, heavier and more restrictive than the ones he remembered from his Navy days. Technology had improved in 8 years, but somehow the suits had gotten more complicated rather than simpler. A technician helped him seal the helmet and activate the radiation shielding. The suit's internal display lit up with warnings about the radiation levels he was about to encounter. Cole had seen similar warnings before, though never quite this severe. He took a breath and followed Dr. Nina Patel through the airlock into the Valiant's engine room. The first thing that struck Cole was the scale of everything. The old fusion drives he had worked on were large, certainly, but this quantum fusion system was something else entirely. It filled the entire compartment, a massive assembly of containment vessels, field generators, and cooling systems. Blue emergency lighting cast strange shadows across the machinery, and the air inside his suit carried a faint metallic taste despite the filters. Radiation detectors on his suit chirped softly, a constant reminder that this room could kill him if the shielding failed. Patel walked him through the basic layout, pointing out the major components and explaining their functions. Cole listened and nodded, but he was not really paying attention to her words. He was looking at the engine with the eyes of someone who had spent 2 decades learning to see what others missed. There was a rhythm to broken machinery, a pattern that experienced engineers could recognize. Cole moved slowly around the drive, occasionally stopping to examine something more closely through his helmet's faceplate. The containment field generators were arranged in a circular pattern around the central reaction chamber. Cole counted 12 of them, each one the size of a small car. They should have been perfectly aligned, forming a symmetrical cage of electromagnetic force around the quantum reaction. But something about them looked wrong to Cole, though he could not immediately identify what was bothering him. He moved closer to one of the generators, studying the way it was mounted to the engine frame. The mounting brackets caught his attention. They were heavy pieces of reinforced metal, designed to hold the generators in precise positions despite the enormous forces generated during operation. Cole had seen similar brackets on the old fusion drives, though those had been much simpler. He knelt down, awkward in the bulky suit, and examined the bracket more closely. There were stress marks on the metal, small cracks that spider-webbed out from the mounting points. Cole frowned and moved to the next generator. Same thing, stress cracks in the brackets. He stood up and turned to Patel, who had been watching him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Cole asked her about the mounting brackets, whether anyone had examined them for damage. Patel's expression inside her helmet suggested she thought the question was ridiculous. She explained that the brackets were structural components, not part of the quantum system itself. They held the generators in place but did not affect the operation of the drive. The problem was in the quantum fusion reaction, not in the mounting hardware. Cole accepted this explanation but continued examining the brackets anyway. He moved from generator to generator, studying each mounting point with the kind of attention that Patel clearly found excessive. The cracks were subtle, the kind of damage that would not show up on most diagnostic scans. They were stress fractures, the result of repeated thermal expansion and contraction over months or years of operation. Cole had seen similar damage before on the old destroyer Ranger, though the circumstances had been different. He remembered that incident clearly, even though it had been nearly a decade ago. The Ranger's main reactor had begun showing signs of instability, and the engineering team had spent days trying to diagnose the problem. Everyone had focused on the reactor core itself, running endless diagnostics and simulations. Cole had been the one to notice that the reactor's mounting frame had shifted slightly, just a few millimeters, but enough to throw off the magnetic containment. The solution had been simple once the problem was identified. They had realigned the mounting frame and the reactor had stabilized immediately. Cole asked Patel if it was possible that the mounting brackets had shifted position over time, causing the field generators to become misaligned. Patel considered the question and then shook her head. The brackets were designed to be immovable, locked into position with precision that could not drift on its own. Even if they had shifted, she added, it would only cause a minor misalignment, nothing that could lead to a complete containment field collapse. The quantum systems were designed with enough tolerance to handle small variations, but Cole was not convinced. He had learned over his career that small problems could cascade into large failures if conditions were right. A few millimeters of misalignment in one generator could affect its field output. That altered field could interfere with neighboring generators. The interference could create resonance patterns that stressed the entire containment system. Given enough time, the stress could lead to exactly the kind of catastrophic failure they had seen. It was not a quantum physics problem at all. It was a basic mechanical problem that had quantum consequences. Patel listened to his theory with visible skepticism. She pointed out that if the brackets were the problem, the diagnostic systems would have detected the misalignment. The Valiant had some of the most sophisticated monitoring equipment ever installed on a warship. Nothing escaped its attention. Cole countered that diagnostic systems only looked for what they were programmed to find. If no one had told the system to check for bracket integrity, it might have missed the slow degradation over time. Patel admitted that was possible, but insisted it was unlikely. Cole asked if they could run a structural integrity scan on the mounting hardware. It would only take a few minutes and would either confirm or disprove his theory. Patel agreed, though her tone suggested she thought it was a waste of time. She activated her suit's communication system and contacted the command center. Within minutes, a technician had programmed one of the ship's sensor arrays to scan the engine room's structural components. The results would take a few minutes to compile. While they waited, Cole continued his examination of the engine room. He looked at other components, checking for signs of damage or wear that might have been overlooked. The old habit of thoroughness was hard to break, even after years away from active duty. Patel watched him work, and Cole could sense her slowly revising her initial dismissal of him. She asked him about his service record, about the ships he had served on. Cole answered briefly, uncomfortable with the attention. He had never been good at talking about himself. The structural scan results came through on Patel's display. She reviewed them in silence, her expression hidden behind her helmet. Then she looked at Cole with something that might have been surprise. The scan had detected exactly what Cole had predicted. The mounting brackets showed extensive microfracture damage. More importantly, the scan revealed that the field generators were misaligned by small but measurable amounts. The misalignment was not uniform, suggesting that the brackets had failed at different rates over time. Patel immediately contacted the command center and requested that the entire expert team review the scan results. There was an urgency in her voice that had not been there before. Cole followed her back through the airlock, feeling the weight of the protective suit more acutely now that his adrenaline was fading. They removed their suits in silence, and then Patel led him back to the command center at a pace that was almost a run. The command center erupted into activity when Patel shared the scan results. Dr. Catherine, Wright pulled up the data on the main display and began running calculations. Professor Alan Chase cross-referenced the misalignment measurements with the containment field collapse timeline. Leonard Hayes started building a mathematical model that incorporated the bracket failures. Even Chase, who had barely acknowledged Cole's presence earlier, was now studying the data with intense focus. Admiral Hayes entered the room and immediately sensed that something had changed. She looked at Cole, then at Patel, silently asking for an explanation. Patel provided a brief summary of what Cole had found. The experts were forced to reconsider everything they had assumed about the failure. If Cole was right and the problem was mechanical rather than quantum, then all of their sophisticated theoretical solutions had been addressing the wrong issue. They had been trying to fix the quantum reaction when they should have been looking at the mounting hardware. Dr. Wright was the first to admit it. She had been so focused on the resonance cascade theory that she had never considered the possibility that the generators themselves were not properly aligned. Her simulations had assumed perfect positioning because that was what the specifications called for. But specifications meant nothing if the hardware had degraded over time. Professor Chase grudgingly agreed, admitting that he had made the same assumption. They had all been looking at the complex quantum systems while ignoring the basic mechanical components that supported them. Cole stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching the experts rebuild their understanding of the problem. He felt out of place among these brilliant people with their advanced degrees and sophisticated theories. But he also felt a quiet satisfaction. The atmosphere in the command center had shifted from frustration to cautious excitement. The expert team gathered around the holographic display, examining the structural scan results from every possible angle. The microfractures in the mounting brackets were clearly visible now that everyone knew to look for them. Dr. Catherine Wright traced the crack patterns with her finger, muttering calculations under her breath. Professor Alan Chase had pulled up the Valiant's maintenance logs and was cross-referencing them with the bracket degradation timeline. Danny Cole watched from his position near the back of the room, feeling both vindicated and uncomfortable. He had found the problem, yes, but finding it and fixing it were two very different things. The experts were already deep into technical discussions about solutions, using language that left Cole behind within minutes. They threw around terms like quantum field harmonics and electromagnetic resonance dampening. Cole understood maybe half of what they were saying, and that was being generous. Dr. Nina Patel noticed his discomfort and moved to stand beside him. She spoke quietly, explaining what the others were discussing in simpler terms. The problem was now clear, she said. The mounting brackets had degraded over time, causing the field generators to shift out of alignment. The misalignment created interference patterns in the containment field, and those patterns had eventually caused the catastrophic collapse. It was exactly as Cole had suggested, a simple mechanical problem that had quantum consequences. But understanding the problem did not automatically provide a solution. The mounting brackets could not be replaced while the engine was still flooded with exotic radiation. They could not drain the radiation without cooling the engine, and they could not cool the engine without risking a complete meltdown. Even if they could somehow replace the brackets, realigning the field generators with the precision required would take weeks of careful work. They were trapped in a catch-22 situation where every potential solution created new problems. Cole listened to Patel's explanation and felt a familiar itch in the back of his mind. He had encountered similar situations before, though never at this scale or complexity. Sometimes the direct solution was impossible, and you had to find an indirect approach. He thought back to his time on the destroyer Ranger, to the reactor alignment problem he had solved years ago. They had not been able to move the reactor itself, so instead they had moved everything around it. Could the same principle apply here? He interrupted the expert discussion with a question that made everyone turn to look at him. Could they realign the field generators without replacing the brackets? The experts exchanged glances, and Dr. Wright answered with barely concealed irritation. The generators were locked into position by the damaged brackets. Moving them would require replacing the brackets first. That was the whole problem. Cole nodded, accepting the rebuke, but pressed his question further. What if they did not move the generators but adjusted their field output to compensate for the misalignment? Professor Chase immediately objected. The field generators were not designed for that kind of fine adjustment. They operated at fixed output levels determined by the quantum fusion reaction. You could not just dial them up or down like volume controls. Cole agreed that was true for normal operation, but pointed out that these were not normal circumstances. Every ship he had ever served on had emergency adjustment systems, redundant controls designed for combat damage or critical failures. Did the Valiant have similar systems? Lucas Bennett, who had been silent throughout the discussion, spoke up. The Valiant did have emergency adjustment servos on each field generator. They were crude systems by modern standards, designed for rough adjustments in combat situations. They had never been intended for precision alignment work. Using them for that purpose would be like performing surgery with a hammer, Bennett said, echoing almost exactly what Cole had been thinking. But Cole had used hammers to perform delicate work before, when no better tools were available. Dr. Wright dismissed the idea immediately. The servos were too imprecise for the kind of alignment they needed. Even a small error would risk another containment field collapse, possibly worse than the first one. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a millimeter. The emergency servos were designed to move things by centimeters, not fractions of millimeters. It was impossible. Cole accepted her assessment but asked if he could see the technical specifications. For the servos anyway. Leonard Hayes pulled up the servo documentation on his tablet and handed it to Cole. Cole studied the diagrams carefully, recognizing the basic design despite the advanced technology. They were hydraulic systems, using pressurized fluid to move heavy components with considerable force. Simple, robust, and reliable. But Wright was correct that they lacked precision. The control systems were binary on or off with no fine gradation between states. Using them for precision alignment would indeed be nearly impossible. Nearly impossible was not the same as completely impossible. Cole had an idea, though he was not sure if it would work at this scale. He explained that on the old Fusion-class destroyers, they had used similar servo systems for emergency repairs. The official procedure was to activate them in short bursts, all or nothing. But Cole had discovered through trial and error that you could achieve finer control by firing the servos in extremely short pulses. The inertia of the heavy components would cause them to drift slightly between pulses, and by timing the pulses carefully, you could guide them into position with surprising precision. The experts listened with varying degrees of skepticism. Professor Chase asked how Cole had developed this technique. Cole admitted that he had figured it out by accident during a desperate repair attempt on the destroyer Liberty 16 years ago. The reactor cooling system had been damaged in combat, and the mounting frame had warped from thermal stress. Cole had spent 18 hours firing servo pulses, watching feedback sensors and making tiny adjustments. It had worked, though he had never been entirely sure why. He had just followed his instincts and gotten lucky. Dr. Patel asked the crucial question. Could the same technique work on the Valiant's field generators? Cole was honest. He did not know. The quantum fusion drive was far more complex than anything he had worked on before. The tolerances were tighter, the consequences of failure more severe. But the basic principle should be the same. Heavy objects, servo systems, the physics of motion and inertia. If they could monitor the generator positions precisely enough, and if Cole could feel the feedback through the controls the way he had on the old ships, then maybe it was possible. Professor Chase pulled up a calculator and began running numbers. He modeled the servo system, the mass of the field generators, the required precision of alignment. His fingers flew over his tablet as he built equations that filled multiple screens. The room fell silent except for the quiet tapping of Chase's stylus. Everyone waited, knowing that his calculations would determine whether Cole's idea had any merit or was just wishful thinking based on outdated experience. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, Chase looked up from his calculations. His expression was complicated, mixing surprise with reluctant admiration. According to his models, Cole's approach might work. The key word was might. The probability of success was not high, perhaps 30% under optimal conditions. But 30% was infinitely better than 0%, which was where they had been before Cole arrived. The technique would require incredibly precise timing, constant monitoring of multiple sensor feeds, and probably a fair amount of luck. But it was theoretically possible. Dr. Wright studied Chase's calculations and found no obvious flaws in his mathematics. She still thought the idea was risky, potentially catastrophic if anything went wrong. But she also acknowledged that they had no better alternatives. 3 weeks of work by the best minds in quantum engineering had produced nothing but failure. Maybe it was time to try something different. Even if that something seemed crazy by conventional standards. She looked at Admiral Hayes, silently asking for a decision. Admiral Hayes had been listening to the entire discussion without comment. Now she stepped forward and asked Cole a direct question. If they authorized this attempt, could he do it? Not in theory, but in practice. Could he sit at those controls and guide those field generators back into alignment, using nothing but servo pulses and instinct? Cole met her eyes and answered honestly. He did not know if he could do it. He had done similar things before, but never at this scale or with this much at stake. But if they were willing to let him try, he would give it everything he had. Hayes made her decision quickly, the way good commanders did when time was critical. They would attempt Cole's solution. The expert team would monitor the quantum systems and provide calculations, but Cole would control the adjustment process. He was the only one who had experience with this kind of repair work. The experts were clearly unhappy with this decision, but none of them objected out loud. They had failed where Cole had succeeded in finding the problem. Perhaps he deserved the chance to fix it as well. Commander Greg Murphy approached Cole after the meeting broke up. He asked if Cole was sure about this, if he truly believed he could pull it off. The preparation for the alignment attempt took 6 hours. The expert team needed time to set up monitoring equipment, calibrate sensors, and establish protocols for the procedure. Danny Cole spent those hours studying the servo control system, familiarizing himself with the interface and response times. It was more advanced than anything he had used before, but the basic principles remained the same. He would fire pulses of hydraulic pressure, watch how the generators moved, and make constant micro-adjustments based on feedback. Dr. Catherine Wright set up a holographic display that showed the position of all 12 field generators in real time. The display was color-coded, with red indicating misalignment and green indicating proper position. Currently, everything was red. Wright explained that Cole would need to get all 12 generators into the green zone simultaneously. If even one remained misaligned, the containment field would not stabilize properly. The task seemed impossible when laid out visually like that, but Cole had learned long ago not to think about the whole problem at once. You broke it down, handled one piece at a time, and trusted the process. Professor Alan Chase established sensor feeds that would monitor the quantum field interactions as Cole worked. If the alignment process started causing dangerous resonance patterns, Chase would alert Cole immediately. They had set up automatic safety cutoffs that would shut down the servos if the radiation level spiked, or if the quantum reactions showed signs of instability. Cole appreciated the safety measures, though he knew that once he started, stopping might be just as dangerous as continuing. Sometimes you had to commit fully to a repair attempt and trust your instincts. Dr. Nina Patel and Leonard Hayes worked together to create a mathematical model that would predict the optimal servo pulse timing. Their calculations suggested that pulses lasting exactly 0.03 seconds, fired in a specific sequence, would provide the best chance of success. Cole reviewed their recommendations but knew he would likely deviate from them once he started working. Mathematics was important, but so was feel. After 2 decades of repair work, Cole had learned to listen to the equipment, to sense when something was moving correctly or starting to bind. That intuition could not be programmed into a computer. Admiral Patricia Hayes visited Cole in the control room an hour before the scheduled attempt. She found him sitting at the servo control station, running through practice sequences without actually activating anything. Hayes sat down in the chair beside him and asked if he was nervous. Cole admitted that he was terrified. This was not like the old destroyer repairs where failure meant a broken ship. If he made a mistake here, he could destroy the Valiant and possibly damage the entire orbital station. Hundreds of lives depended on him getting this right. Hayes listened and then told him something she had learned during her years of command. Fear was not weakness. Fear was your mind understanding the stakes and preparing you to be careful. The dangerous people were the ones who felt no fear because they did not understand what they were risking. She had read Cole's service record, all of it, including the classified sections. She knew about the Liberty repair, about the desperate situation on the Independence, about the dozen other times Cole had done the impossible. If anyone could do this, it was him. She believed that, or she would not have authorized the attempt. Her words helped, though Cole still felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He thanked Hayes for the confidence and she left him to his preparations. Lucas Bennett stopped by next, offering technical support and answering last-minute questions about the servo systems. Commander Greg Murphy arrived with coffee and a sandwich, forcing Cole to eat something despite his lack of appetite. The maintenance worker, who had been invisible to most people on the station, now found himself at the center of attention. It was uncomfortable but also strangely touching. The expert team assembled in the command center at the designated time. Cole took his position at the servo control station, surrounded by displays showing generator positions, quantum field readings, radiation levels, and structural stress measurements. It was overwhelming, far more complex than the simple readouts he had worked with on the old destroyers. Dr. Wright walked him through each display one more time, explaining what to watch for. Cole nodded along, but he knew that once he started, he would focus primarily on the servo response and trust the experts to alert him if something went critically wrong. Admiral Hayes gave the authorization to begin. Cole took a breath, placed his hands on the control interface, and fired the first servo pulse on Generator 1. It was a tiny burst of hydraulic pressure, lasting less than 1/10 of a second. The generator shifted by a fraction of a millimeter. Cole watched the feedback, felt the system's response, and fired again. Another tiny shift. This was going to take a while. The first hour was spent on just Generator 1, moving it incrementally toward proper alignment. Cole fell into a rhythm, firing pulses, waiting for the feedback, adjusting his timing based on how the generator responded. It was meditation through repetition. His entire focus narrowed down to the servo controls and the position readings. The experts watched in silence, occasionally exchanging glances but not interrupting. They could see that Cole had entered a state of deep concentration, and disturbing him might break the delicate flow. Generator 1 finally reached the green zone after 90 minutes of constant adjustment. Cole allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before moving to Generator 2. But he quickly discovered a problem. As he adjusted Generator 2, Generator 1 started drifting out of alignment again. The generators were not independent of each other. Moving one affected the forces on its neighbors. Cole would need to adjust multiple generators simultaneously, keeping them all balanced while slowly working toward proper alignment. The complexity of the task had just increased exponentially. He adapted his approach, switching between generators more rapidly, making smaller adjustments to each one. It was like juggling while walking a tightrope, requiring absolute focus and constant awareness of multiple systems at once. Professor Chase provided running commentary on the quantum field readings, noting when Cole's adjustments were improving the field coherence. Dr. Patel monitored structural stress, watching for signs that the servo activity might be causing additional damage to the already weakened brackets. 3 hours into the procedure, Cole hit a wall. Generators 1 through 4 were approaching proper alignment, but generators 5 and 6 were proving stubborn. Every adjustment he made seemed to push them further out of position, rather than correcting them. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool temperature in the control room. His hands were starting to shake from the tension of maintaining such precise control for so long. Dr. Wright suggested taking a break, but Cole refused. He was in the flow now, and stopping might mean losing the feel for the system. Leonard Hayes noticed something in the mathematical models. He suggested that Cole reverse his approach on generators 5 and 6, moving them away from proper alignment before bringing them back in. It seemed counterintuitive, but Hayes's calculations showed it might break the feedback loop that was causing problems. Cole considered the suggestion and decided to trust it. Hayes had been right about everything else so far. He fired servos on generator 5 in the opposite direction, watching it move further into the red zone on the display. The move worked. By taking generator 5 out of its stuck position, Cole created space to adjust generator 6. Then he could bring both of them back toward alignment together, balancing their forces against each other. It was elegant in its simplicity, and Cole made a mental note to thank Hayes later. The breakthrough renewed his energy, and he attacked the problem with fresh determination. Generators 7 through 12 followed similar patterns, each one presenting unique challenges that required creative solutions. 5 hours into the attempt, Cole had 10 generators in the green zone. Only generators 11 and 12 remained out of alignment, but they were the most difficult ones. They were positioned opposite each other in the circular array, and any adjustment to one immediately affected the other. Cole tried several approaches, each one failing to achieve stable alignment. The entire command center watched in tense silence as he worked through the problem, his hands moving over the controls with increasing desperation. Dr. Catherine Wright made a suggestion. What if Cole adjusted both generators simultaneously, firing their servos in perfect synchronization? It would require incredible timing, but it might be the only way to balance their opposing forces. Cole knew she was right. He had been avoiding this approach because it was so risky, but he was running out of alternatives. He placed both hands on the control interface, positioning his fingers over the servo triggers for generators 11 and 12. He would need to fire them at exactly the same instant, hold them for exactly the same duration, and repeat the process dozens of times until both generators reached proper position. The synchronized adjustments were brutally difficult. Cole had to split his attention between two separate feedback streams, processing information from both generators simultaneously, while maintaining identical timing on the servo pulses. The control room erupted in cheers when the Valiant's main power systems came fully online. Officers and technicians who had maintained professional composure for weeks finally allowed themselves to celebrate. Dr. Nina Patel hugged Leonard Hayes, both of them laughing with relief. Professor Alan Chase slumped in his chair, looking 10 years older than he had that morning but wearing a smile that suggested he had just witnessed something remarkable. Even Dr. Catherine Wright allowed herself a moment of happiness, though she quickly returned to monitoring her instruments to ensure the containment field remained stable. Danny Cole sat at the servo control station, watching the celebration with a sense of detachment that came from complete exhaustion. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, muscles cramping and joints aching from 23 hours of intense concentration. His eyes burned from staring at displays for so long without adequate breaks. He wanted nothing more than to find a quiet corner somewhere and sleep for a week. But people kept approaching him, shaking his hand, patting his back, thanking him for what he had done. Admiral Patricia Hayes cut through the crowd of well-wishers and stood in front of Cole. The room gradually fell silent as everyone realized the Admiral wanted to speak. Hayes looked at Cole for a long moment before extending her hand. Cole stood up, his legs protesting the movement, and shook her hand. Hayes told him that what he had accomplished today would be remembered for a long time. He had done what the best experts in human space could not do. He had saved the Valiant and possibly saved the outer colonies from the Krellian advance. The fleet owed him a debt that could never be fully repaid. Cole felt uncomfortable with the praise and tried to deflect it. He pointed out that the expert team had identified the problem once they knew where to look. They had set up the monitoring equipment, provided calculations, and caught potential problems before they became critical. He had just been the one operating the controls. Hayes smiled at his modesty, but did not let him minimize his contribution. Yes, the team had helped, but Cole had been the one with the skill and experience to execute the repair. Without him, all their knowledge would have been useless. The experts approached one by one to offer their own acknowledgments. Dr. Wright apologized for her initial dismissal of him, admitting that she had let her academic prejudices blind her to the value of practical experience. Professor Chase thanked Cole for teaching him something important about looking beyond theory to consider basic mechanical realities. Dr. Patel told Cole that she wanted to study his technique, perhaps develop training programs that could teach other engineers his hands-on approach. Leonard Hayes simply shook Cole's hand and said it had been an honor to work with him. Lucas Bennett arrived with Commander Greg Murphy, both men grinning like they had won the lottery. Murphy reminded Cole that this had all started with him noticing something unusual in a personnel file. Cole had proven that sometimes the best solution came from the most unexpected places. Bennett added that he had already sent a detailed report to Fleet Engineering Command, recommending that Cole's servo pulse technique be added to emergency repair protocols throughout the Navy. Cole listened to all of this with increasing discomfort. He had never sought recognition or fame. He just liked fixing broken things. The celebration continued for another hour before Admiral Hayes finally dispersed everyone to their duties. The Valiant still needed extensive work before it would be ready for combat operations, but now that work could proceed normally instead of in crisis mode. Hayes asked Cole to remain behind after the others left. When they were alone, she invited him to her office for a private conversation. Cole followed, wondering if he was about to receive some kind of official commendation that he would have to politely decline. Hayes's office was surprisingly modest for someone of her rank. A desk, a few chairs, and windows that looked out at the orbital station and the planet beyond. Hayes poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on her desk and handed one to Cole. She gestured for him to sit, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Hayes asked Cole a question that had been bothering her since Murphy first brought him to her attention. Why had he never pursued a commission or higher rank during his Navy career? With his skills and problem-solving abilities, he could have been an officer easily. Cole considered the question carefully before answering. He explained that he had never been interested in commanding ships or managing people. Those were important jobs, and he respected the people who did them, but they were not for him. He liked being in the engine room, liked working with his hands, liked the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it work again. An officer's career path would have taken him away from that hands-on work. Promoted him into positions where he would spend more time with paperwork and meetings than with actual machinery. Hayes understood that explanation better than Cole might have expected. She admitted that sometimes the military's promotion system pushed talented people into positions where they were less effective than they had been at lower ranks. The assumption was always that moving up was better, but that was not true for everyone. Some people were exactly where they belonged. Still, Hayes said, Cole's current position as a maintenance worker on an orbital station seemed like a waste of his abilities. The fleet needed people like him, especially now with the war against the Krellian Empire intensifying. She made Cole an offer. She wanted him to serve as a consultant to the fleet, specifically for emergency repair situations that conventional approaches could not solve. He would not have to join the military again, or deal with the bureaucracy he had left behind when he retired. Instead, he would be called in when ships faced problems that stumped their regular engineering teams. He could work on his own terms, accept or decline assignments as he chose, and continue doing maintenance work on the station during the quiet periods. The pay would be significantly better than his current salary, and he would have access to any resources he needed. Cole listened to the proposal with mixed feelings. Part of him was tempted by the challenge of working on more complex problems, of helping ships and crews in desperate situations. But another part of him liked the simple life he had built over the past 8 years. No stress, no life or death decisions, just routine maintenance and the occasional interesting repair. Hayes seemed to sense his hesitation and told him to take time to think about it. This was not a decision that needed to be made immediately. She would leave the offer open indefinitely. They talked for another 20 minutes about less serious matters. Hayes asked about Cole's family, learned that he had a daughter living on Mars who worked as a teacher. Cole asked about the war, and Hayes gave him an honest assessment that was more pessimistic than what she told most people. The Krellian Empire was not interested in negotiation or compromise. They wanted human space, and they were willing to fight for it. Every ship mattered, every advantage counted. The Valiant's return to service would help, but the conflict was far from over. Eventually, Cole excused himself, explaining that he desperately needed sleep before he collapsed. Hayes walked him to the door and thanked him one more time. As Cole left her office, he ran into Commander Murphy waiting in the hallway. Murphy had arranged for Cole to have guest quarters on the upper levels of the station, much nicer than his usual cramped compartment in the maintenance section. Murphy also informed him that the station commander had authorized 2 weeks of paid leave, starting immediately. Cole protested that he had maintenance duties scheduled, but Murphy waved away his concerns. Those duties could wait. Cole had earned a rest. The guest quarters were indeed much nicer than Cole's normal living space. A real bed instead of a bunk, a sitting area with comfortable furniture and windows that showed the curve of Earth below. Cole took a long shower, feeling the tension slowly drain from his muscles. He changed into clean clothes and sat down on the bed, intending to rest for just a moment before finding something to eat. He was asleep within seconds. He woke 16 hours later, disoriented and confused about where he was. Memory returned slowly, bringing with it the realization that he had actually done it, the impossible repair, the 23-hour marathon of servo adjustments, the successful restart of the Valiant's quantum fusion drive. It seemed almost like a dream, too improbable to have really happened. But the soreness in his hands and the exhaustion still present in his bones confirmed that it had been very real. Cole spent the next few days in a strange kind of limbo. People recognized him now when he walked through the station corridors. Some thanked him, others just stared with expressions of respect or curiosity. The maintenance crews treated him like a celebrity, asking for stories about the old destroyer days and the various repairs he had performed. Cole endured the attention as best he could, though he found it increasingly uncomfortable. He was just a mechanic who had gotten lucky, nothing more. On his 5th day of leave, Cole made his decision about Admiral Hayes's offer. He contacted her office and accepted the consultant position, with one condition. He wanted to continue doing some regular maintenance work on the side. Hayes had predicted this condition and readily agreed to it.